This is piped in. Yep. Guys, thank you very much for coming. We've unfortunately had a bit of a rumour that there is a stopped one train that's got 3 of our panellists on it. Other than that tiny little bit of information, that modicum that it's stopped, we don't know the cause. Given Craig's presence, I don't want to oversell or say that I know more than's going on. We're going to get started, when those folk have come up. But in the meantime, there are reports. Grab one of those. It's a magnificent report, and there's some food and drinks and nibbles on the back. So hang tight, and we'll be with you shortly.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Tau Centre in our Brown Institute home here. I'm Emily Bell, the Director of the Tau Centre. I'm very grateful to Craig Silverman and our panel who've been stuck on the subway, which is a sort of a personal nightmare of mine. So A, serves you right for working downtown. B, thank you for doing that so we didn't have to be. This is the launch of Craig Silverman's epic oeuvre, Lies, Damn Lies and Viral Content. It's like one of those things where if you're a journalism professor and something arrives the day before a class when you're talking about debunking rumours, you think, God, did I really commission that? That's brilliant. But this is a kind of a really sort of, such a kind of germane subject at the moment for everybody in journalism, which is how do we keep up with false information, how do we debunk it, what's our role as journalists. I said I wasn't going to introduce it. I was going to introduce our senior research fellow who's been stewarding this with Craig, Fergus Pitt, but we will have, Craig will talk through the findings and then we'll have a panel after it. Okay.
There's very little else to add other than to say that there are reports at the back, so do grab one of those on your way out if you didn't grab one on the way in. There are some nibbles. So the way that it's going to run is Craig Silverman is going to do 20 to 30 minutes on the kind of like highlights from the report and his huge amount of research both in the books and getting into the data. And then Max Reed, who's the editor-in-chief of Gawker, Anna DeBanco, who's the managing editor of Dig, and Margarita Noriega, who's Fusion's social media director, are going to kind of go through a little bit of what's in the report, but mostly try and give it a little bit of forward spin, and we'll have some questions. I'll remind you again at the end when we do the questions that it'll be questions, not statements. You'll notice that there's a question mark at the end of what you say. We've got plenty of time for questions, so one question each, and then if we need to come back to you, we can do that. Thank you again for coming up on such a cold night. I'll let Craig kick it off.
Hello, is that working? All right. So I'm grateful to the Tau Center for the opportunity to do this report, and hopefully, this is useful information for those of you who are working journalists or students or academics as well, in terms of what you see out there, but also in the way you might do your daily work. So I'm going to dive into the key findings, but one of the things I wanted to sort of share was a story of one particular rumor that we ended up tracking. And I'll tell you about the methodology and that piece after this. But this was, a very striking photo that came out of Kobani, and it was one that was shared a little bit on social media, and it didn't really get a lot of notice until this gentleman from India put it in a tweet and declared that this woman, her name was Rihanna, she's killed 100 Islamic State fighters, and retweet to celebrate her. And so you can see, thousands of people did that. And at this point, where basically, the evidence is one photo and a guy who is not in the region, who is not really a journalist, who doesn't have any evidence around this, makes this claim. And so what happens is, we get a bunch of news articles about that. So news sites, whoops, I'll stay off this thing. News sites start to talk about it. And, you can see the one on the top there, they put the claim kind of in quotes. Somebody's saying this. This one just straight up is saying she's done this. And so this is, one of the dynamics we saw a lot, where something would kind of get out there, it would get on social media, or it'd be in one news outlet, and then a bunch of other people would sort of jump on it. And they would treat it in different ways. Some of the ways conveying it as true, some of the ways kind of capturing the ambiguity. So this sort of turned her into a bit of a legend, and because of that, Islamic State said, well, we have to stop this. So Islamic State then put out a tweet claiming that they had beheaded her. And so there was this photo on Twitter of a fighter holding a decapitated head. It didn't look like her. It actually looked kind of photoshopped when I looked at it. But we again saw people sort of saying, okay, so now Islamic State has said that they've beheaded her. And you can see the one in the middle, again, just declaring, this has happened. And at this point, there's no evidence that that's her name. There's no evidence she's killed these fighters. There's really no evidence that she has been beheaded. But we've got, an ongoing narrative with lots of claims going on here. And then we see some people in the region saying, no, she's alive. But there's no more pictures of her. There's no interviews with her. Nobody has put her on the phone or anything like that. So we've got this sort of continuing claim going on. And there's still really no evidence yet of anything, except that there's this picture of this woman. And so eventually we get to the point where somebody decides to, okay, I'm going to unpack this. So the BBC, and there were a couple other places that sort of did, all right, so what do we actually know about this woman? And what the BBC revealed was, there's basically one Western journalist who's actually met this woman. Islamic State has declared to have beheaded her twice, in fact. Once really early on before she was famous, and then again when she was famous, and that got more news attention. So we have this thing that's turned into a legend. There's been, I don't know, between 10 and 20 articles written about her and her supposed beheading and all that. And then we have sort of one debunking. And the one journalist that the BBC pointed to is this Swedish journalist named Karl Drott, who had taken this photo when he saw her. It was back in August when she was inducted into the Home Guard in Kobani. And so he said, this was a photo that I took of her that day. He didn't take that really famous photo. And then he posted on Facebook, and he was really kind of upset with what had happened because there was, number one, he said there was no evidence that her name was Rihanna. He didn't remember her name, but he never met a Kurdish woman who had that name. He said she was part of the Home Guard, so she wasn't actually on the front lines. The chances that she killed any Islamic State soldiers is very, very slim. And the idea that she's been beheaded is also probably unlikely. And so Karl Drott then posts on Facebook, he's saying how, she was doing enough. You don't need to add all these things to her. But he says, unfortunately, there's not an iconic picture for every fantastic story and vice versa. And in this case, you had this image that wasn't getting a lot of attention, and then a guy combines it with a really newsworthy claim, and all of a sudden it sets off this chain reaction of a bunch of claims, against claims, against claims, against claims, and all of it sort of playing out in the press, because that's what Islamic State wanted. They wanted that to get out in the press, and that's what others wanted. And so this was the kind of dynamic that we saw a lot, and we actually ended up tracking in the database, which I'll describe in a second, the articles that talked about her being beheaded. So we tracked that one specific rumor, whether or not she'd been beheaded. And so we had 14 total news articles that we found. There were about 30,000 total shares and Facebook interactions for those articles. And to this day, there's still 2 news articles that declare that she's been beheaded. There's no evidence for that at all. We found 5 debunkings of that particular claim, and then there were 7 that really sat in that middle zone. And you can see the Breitbart one there. It leads with report, : So they're saying, well, this is out there. We don't know if it's true. So they're using that kind of hedging language in this attribution framework to say that. And so to this day, there's 7 who say, well, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. It's most likely not true. The photo was really doctored. Islamic State has a history of just, saying they've killed anybody at any time who gets some attention. But this was an example of the kind of thing that we would see come out there. And there were like 3 or 4 different rumors attached to this one particular woman. So I mentioned we were tracking rumors. So here's the way the methodology worked. The idea was to look at how news sites cover rumors, unverified claims, and sort of viral content that falls into that category of being unverified, and to see, when they decide to talk about these things, how do they talk about it? What kind of coverage do they give it? Do they update these articles? Do they correct them? What language do they use when they talk about rumors? And then also to look at, well, when something turns out to be false, does it get debunked? And do the debunking spread as far as things that are, that were claiming it to be true in the initial stage? And so what we did was we would identify a rumor, and we would then log that in a database, and then we'd look for news articles about that rumor. And we would classify those articles in 3 ways. They were either for the rumor, so like we see on the previous one here, so they would declaratively say this has happened. They would be against it, debunking it, or observing, where they have the hedging language. And so we wanted to see, do those things change over time? What kind of language do they use when they do that? And so from collecting that, we ended up having, in the course of a few months here, it was about 1,600 news articles about more than 100 rumors. And this is the data that informed the report, as well as some interviews that were done with people who are engaged in debunking. So I want to quickly, before doing the findings, just give a very, very short and not completely comprehensive grounding in a bit of the psychology of rumor, because rumors are actually a very natural occurring phenomenon. They're a very natural human reaction to certain events. And this is, it's uncertainty, fear, anxiety, also situations where we lack certain information. We respond to that by trying to fill in the gaps, and we respond to that by doing it together. So it's called shared sense making, where we all try to figure out what's going on. We try to answer questions we don't have answers to. And a really good example of this it came when the Malaysian Airlines flight just disappeared. We engaged in this kind of shared sense making activity. This is a rumor researcher. And so, he's basically said, we're social beings and we possess an irrepressible instinct to make sense of the world, and you put them together and we get shared sense making. So people put out rumors because they're trying to figure things out. People share them because that reason or that explanation makes sense to them. And you just start going and going and going. And as I mentioned, when this flight disappeared, there was no evidence, so the flight was gone, nobody knew what happened, nobody knew why it happened, and yet there was a huge amount of interest in it and huge amount of anxiety about this. And so what you basically had in the press was a huge amount of speculation and shared sense making taking place. And you get things like this. So this was an introduction to a CNN segment where the guy Richard Quest says, "So many questions, none of which, frankly, we're going to be able to answer for you tonight," which is a good statement, I think, because it's true. But then he introduces his guest and he says, "I've asked him for his gut feeling about what happened to the plane." So you have an entire segment based on some random aviation person's gut feeling. And this is sort of how ideas start to propagate, because he would say things and it might make sense to somebody who's trying to figure this out, and then they might tell their friend, and on and on and on it goes. So, rumors are very natural. They're useful in a lot of ways because they can be sort of the precursor to truth. But a few important points about them. Number one, in the interconnected world, they get out there and they move very fast. This guy on Twitter makes one claim about this photo, and all of a sudden that becomes sort of a new truth for people. They're really, really prevalent, particularly for journalistic interest, in breaking news situations, natural disaster situations, where there's uncertainty and anxiety, and these things cause people to try and fill in that space and figure things out. There's a connection between repetition and belief. So the more people hear a rumor, the more likely they're to believe it, particularly if it's coming from sources they're inclined to trust. And on top of that, and this is true for basically any kind of information, if it aligns with something we already think and believe and feel, then we accept it pretty much right away. And that's one of the challenges with debunking, is when somebody's accepted something, it's actually really hard to dislodge that. So one of the main takeaways for journalists on this is that even if you're trying to be very careful about how you're framing a rumor and the hedging language you use, just the fact that you've decided to give it extra oxygen actually lends some credibility to it, and it may be increasing people being likely to believe it because they may be seeing it in other places as well. Okay, so as I mentioned, the database had a little more than 1,600 articles. We had more than 100 rumors. We tracked these over a span of a few months. And I'll just preface this by saying this will be somewhat depressing. So that's, sort of what came from it. So there was a great quote last year in a New York Times article from Joshua Benton at the Neiman Journalism Lab. And they had asked him about sort of how news organizations deal with viral content and the sort of, the connection between them often being, those stories being false and being viral. And he said that, basically it's journalism as an act of pointing. So they say there's this thing out there, there's this tweet that this woman has killed 100 Islamic State fighters, and that's pretty much what they do. They just sort of point to it and say, it's out there, so we're just acknowledging that for you, and look, here's this thing. And this dominated in the database. The majority of the time when there was a rumor, we saw news organizations just sort of pointing to it and saying, there's this thing. And it's on social media, or it's been reported by somebody else. And there wasn't really an element of verification, there wasn't an element of reporting, there wasn't an element of adding value. It was jumping on it in those early moments when it's fresh and likely to get traffic, and then kind of staying away from it. We didn't see a lot of updates to articles. We didn't see a lot of follow-up articles. It was just sort of in that moment, let's jump on this and let's move on. And so what we kind of saw was this dichotomy. You had folks who do that, so that's the mindless propagators there on one side. They're just trying to get it up and get some traffic and sort of plant a flag on that. And then on the other side, one of the really interesting things were the news organizations who never showed up on the rumors that we were looking at. And we were looking at stuff, coming out of war zones. We were looking at kind of the typical viral stories. We looked at some business and finance rumors. We looked at some world news rumors. And in a lot of cases, we didn't see, for example, the New York Times that often. They weren't really dealing with a lot of stuff that was in that unverified stage. And so what was interesting was that you had people who were dominating the conversation who were just kind of pointing to it and not actually moving it forward. And then you had the other people who were just completely silent, who were probably seeing it, but weren't writing anything about it. And so this is, for me, this is one of the big things that's clear from the research is there's this huge middle ground where if you actually figure out better ways of interacting with this content, with saying, we're looking at this, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, here's what we've been able to add to it, and actually staying with it and trying to do that process of reporting, there seems to be this huge opportunity there. And that was, from the depressing piece, I think that's a really interesting kind of counter strategy and something we'll probably talk about on the panel. So we also looked at examples where you have one news organization putting out a claim and then other people jumping on it. So here's an example of a really, a pretty baseless claim lacking a lot of evidence. This was published in the Free Beacon. And so they claimed that there was about 11 jetliners that were actually captured by terrorists when they took over the Tripoli airport. And so they link it to 9/11 style attacks. They have like one anonymous source in the story, and they have a lot of alarming things saying, well, the US intelligence community is extremely concerned about this. So there wasn't actually any evidence. They had one photo in the story of a person on a plane, but if you looked at other photos from the time, most of the planes were really destroyed beyond being able to be flown. And so we looked at, well, who sort of followed on this rumor? And here's a breakdown of it. So we had 9 news organizations in the United States, in the UK, in Australia, in Africa, and in the Middle East, who sort of straight up said this is true. These airliners have been taken. We had about 8 that repeated it but sort of put the hedging around it. And then we had one who actually debunked it. And that's not even a news organization, technically. That's Snopes. Although arguably, you could put them in the category. Now, there's obviously a partisan element to this. Free Beacon is a conservative-oriented publication. This made the Obama administration, if true, look bad. So you had people who were kind of eager to jump on it. But you also had, news organizations in several different countries around the world. And what happened with this was USA Today, they reached out to some administration officials, but couldn't get really anyone on the record. And the only place that did any reporting was Snopes. Snopes actually found a message board for aviation enthusiasts, which pointed them to a database where you can look up the tail number of planes, and they saw that prior to the airport being taken, a lot of planes were moved out of there by the airlines that were still at the airport. So for them, they labeled it mostly false, and they said that there was actually no proof that there were enough of these airliners still there, and if you looked at all the photos, most of them were destroyed. And so this is a case where people follow on a really dubious claim, don't add anything to it, but when you have this amount of news organizations repeating it, that for a lot of people, if they see it in more than one place, they're going to think, well, this must be true because I saw it in 2 or 3 different places. And this is where something that's a pretty thin claim starts to take on a lot of credibility. So here's one of the things I didn't know about as much before we started this. There are fake news websites out there. They have real-sounding names like National Report and the Daily Current, and they look like news websites, and they write articles that read like real news articles, but it's all completely fake. And the site itself gives no disclosure. And this is different from The Onion. The Onion, they're doing satire, they're making social commentary, and you can see on the site places where they talk about it being satire. These sites are deliberately trying to mislead people, and they're writing stories that go to emotions, that go play on people's fears, because that makes them share it, and if they share it, then people click back and they monetize those clicks. So there's a bit of a business model around that. What we saw were that fake claims, whether it's fake news stories or actually rumors that turn out to be fake, often got more shares than the stuff that was true. And so that's a disappointing thing to see. Here's 3 examples of fake news headlines. Celebrity deaths is a favorite one for them. This was Hugh Hefner. The one on top we'll talk about more in a second. There was a lot of fake news around Ebola. The one in the middle, which seems the most ridiculous, has to date almost 1 million shares and Facebook interactions. So Facebook is they've recently introduced the ability to flag something as fake, And that's in part because this stuff spreads insanely on Facebook when they get a hit. They don't always get hits, but when they do, it goes really big. So a claim about Earth experiencing 6 days of darkness was shared almost 1 million times, which is nicely, suitably depressing. So here's one of my personal favorites. This is National Report. You can see from the top masthead there, they take a sort of conservative point of view. They write fake articles that appeal to people who don't like Obama. So they're appealing to political beliefs because people are more likely to share things they agree with, obviously. So that's part of their strategy. I noticed that with their traffic in October, they had a really good month. They had over 9 million uniques from mobile visitors and 3 million from the web. And October was the month where Ebola was a big deal in the US. And so they got a lot of traffic because they ran stories like this one, where they declared an entire town in Texas had been quarantined because a family had contracted Ebola. And so you can see from the chart on the side there, it was shared 338,000 times, got more than 1,000 likes, so it spread a lot. And we tracked this one to see, well, how did the debunkings do? So you have one fake news article with, roughly about 340,000 shares. We tracked 5 debunkings of it, including local media in Texas, because people were freaking out in this part of Texas, understandably. And Snopes was in on that too, and you can see that the one fake news website easily beat those 5 debunkings there. And this was something we saw again and again. We only saw one example where a fake news article that was spreading a lot was the debunkings had the same amount of shares, and that required more than 10 debunkings from some of the largest sites in the United Kingdom. So it's not easy to make debunkings go viral. Here's another sort of fake false thing. This was one of the rumors we tracked. All of these headlines declare this to be true. It's not true, but in the early moments, we saw a lot of news sites actually writing headlines saying, yes, she has 3 boobs. And so this is an example where something that's not a fake news story that turns out to be false, but gets most of its attention in the early unverified stage. So in the upper corner there is a graphic New York Times did with some of our data, showing that the reports claiming it to be true got way more shares than the ones claiming it to be false. It increased after there were some debunkings, but they never caught up. So that's how our data broke down there. We still have almost 20 news outlets who still to this day say that she had a 3rd breast added. We had a decent number of debunkings, and then some who still sit in the middle. So you have 29 that are incorrect out of the 41 that we tracked. So this is, these are some of the trends we saw. People, they point and retreat. They don't come back to it. They don't update. They don't do a follow-on story. So we have people writing headlines about things that are unverified, declaring them as true. The other one of note with headlines are innuendo headlines, where, like AOL, you take a photoshopped image of a giant crab and you write a headline saying, hey, maybe it's true. Because that, that is more appealing to people than just not writing about it, I guess. And the one on top there is an example that we'll look at a little bit more, but there was this video of a guy who said homophobic things being taken down in the Dallas airport, and at one point people were like, hey, that's Paul Rudd who did that. And it wasn't him, and so when Mediaite updated their article, they just put in updated and left this, sort of maybe it's true headline in there. People have actually studied innuendo headlines, and the way our brains process them, we have to understand them as true first to understand what's being declared, and then we sort of retroactively apply the question mark. So if you do a question headline, you are conveying it as true to people, is basically what the research shows on that. So we've seen this style of headline, and it's just a really bad approach for something that's unverified. One of the other kind of surprising things, initially we set up the database where we do one classification per article. It was either for the rumor or against it. But I realized after about a week that oftentimes the headline says one thing and the body text says another. So we had to redo our database to have one claim for the headline and one for the body text. And what we ended up doing was extracting headlines and doing an analysis, and we found that of those more than 1,600 articles, just under 13% of them had this dissonance, where the headline told you one thing and the body told you something else. And that's a really bad situation to have, mostly because headlines are what frames the understanding for a reader. So whatever you tell them in the headline, you can't really undo that in the body text. And I'll give you 2 examples that were particularly notable. So here's a story on Vox, declaring that Hong Kong's protesters are using the same hands up, don't shoot gesture from Ferguson. So that's the headline. They're doing this. If you read down 2 paragraphs and pass 2 embedded tweets, you get this. It's impossible to say the degree to which protesters are using the gesture as a deliberate nod to Ferguson or borrowing something they'd seen on the news. So you have a headline saying they're doing this and it's related to Ferguson, and then you actually get 2 paragraphs down them saying, well, we don't actually know if there's any connection at all between these two. So this is what we call true observing. The headline declares it true. The body text says, well, maybe, maybe not. This was the most prevalent kind of dissonance. And it's really bad because of examples like this. What gets shared on social media is typically the headline. So even if people don't click through and read the article, they see this, and that's in their mind. So you're actually spreading misinformation just by writing these headlines, even for people who don't read the article and don't necessarily go through it. And the way it broke down, is so of the 70% of the rumors we tracked, they had at least one article that did this. So I want to be clear about that. Not 70% of all articles did this, but of all the rumors, 70% of them had at least one article that did this. And the way they ended up was that the vast majority of them to this day are either unverified or false. So the headlines are completely incorrect in that sense. And so that's one bad option. The other is true-false, where the headline says it's true and the body text says it's false. This is usually because they've actually gone in and updated the body text to say, oh, here's new information. And then they do things like just putting the word updated in the headline. And so for people who just casually see the headline, they think that it's true. So here's examples from the Huffington Post, New York, and Time, where if you're going to update the headline, you may as well actually change the headline so it's not giving people misinformation. It's just a small suggestion, So another thing we studied were the words that people use to convey that something is unverified. And what we found is the most commonly used word in headlines is a variation on report. So, reports say, report, reportedly. This was it was used a lot. And this, again, is just in headlines. What's really distressing is the second most common one was the use of quotes in the headline. So the piece of it that was actually what's unverified was put in quotes. This is really common with UK tabloids we saw. We don't know how people process that, but I think the chance that somebody reads something in quotes and knows that means it's unverified is probably pretty slim, and especially given what we know about how people process question headlines, which is the 5th most common way. So when I look at this, what I think is that the ones that are a little bit weaker, or the hedging words that actually don't really work, are the most common ones, and whereas you get things like allege and rumor used in less than 5% of the cases each. So I think those ones would be a little stronger, but this is a place for additional research where if we knew which ones are processed well by people and accurately, then we could actually use those more. Right now, we're not really sure, except we know that the question headlines, the innuendo headlines, are really bad. Okay, so this is my personal favorite of these. It has 2 hedging words in it. Islamist websites claim Israeli Canadian woman kidnapped by IS, report. So the cognitive processing required to, people are just, they're not going to necessarily unpack this. So what it's saying is that there are Islamist websites claiming something, and there's a report claiming that those Islamist websites are claiming this. So they haven't seen or read the Islamist websites, but there's a report about the claims on Islamist. So you see where it's sort of going there. It's a little bit tortured. Okay, so here's good news. So yes, that's a surprising thing to see, right? So we had one case where there was a really good effective debunking, and it has some lessons in it. I have some other tips I'll give as well. But so this was an example where this got out there online. And it was a photo that a guy just photoshopped together really quickly and joked around with a bunch of people in the fall when everything was pumpkin spiced. And as is often the case with images online, people took the image and reused it, and it was spreading on Twitter. And so a reporter at court said, well, are they actually making a pumpkin spice condom? And so if she had taken the sort of point and retreat approach, she would have just written up an article and said, hey, people are talking about pumpkin spice condoms. Maybe it's real. What she decided to do was actually call the company and call their PR firm and asked them. And she got this sort of equivocal response, so she wrote a story with this headline: Durex will neither conform or deny the pumpkin spice condom, which is a pretty funny headline. I'm okay with this headline personally, I think, because it makes the issue that we don't know, and it's sort of, well, it's in this gray zone, But of course, the tease is that there might be an actual pumpkin spice condom. And what happened was really surprising. So the blue shades there were a few articles that jumped on the Quartz one and reported this as true, which sort of inevitably happens. But after it was confirmed false, Durex put out a statement and talked to BuzzFeed. That's when we saw everyone picking up the story. So news sites started writing about it after it was debunked, and we didn't see a single news site incorrectly say it was true after Durex had actually debunked it. So this was like the best debunked story that we saw, and there's probably a couple reasons for that. So one is Durex put out a statement pretty quickly. So they acted quickly, it didn't take off, there weren't a lot of articles speculating about it, so that was one thing. The second thing is that Durex put out kind of a funny statement. They're a condom company, they tend to do that, and so they made it, they kind of made the story have life because they had fun with it, and it wasn't just sort of a boring knockdown. And this was really key because what we saw was the stories that people wrote. This is the most shared story we found. This was on MTV. They said, okay, cool, it's not real, but let's make up 6 other flavors that aren't happening, right? And so it became this fun thing. It didn't ruin the joke. It didn't hurt the viral potential. And they came up. One of them was the pulled pork flavor. There was also a birthday cake flavor. You can look it up yourself and see the other ones. Okay. So this was really good because it avoided what I call the Cliff Clavin effect. If you're a Cheers fan, do you recognize him? So I'll describe it for people who are younger than me and making me feel old right now. There was on the show Cheers, Cliff was a know-it-all. And in the bar, anytime anybody said something factual or gave an anecdote, he would be like, well, actually, that's not true. And so he was like the worst kind of debunker. He was a know-it-all, he was ruining the joke, and people hated that. And this is a problem that debunkers have, is people like it to be true, they like it to be this funny idea, and you're coming along saying it's not true and you're ruining their enjoyment. And so this happens all the time, and I have an example of that. At one point, there was this image circulating. Anybody see this? This was supposedly Vladimir Putin traveling in a very phallic motorcade, and this was popular on Twitter. And so it wasn't real. Somebody rearranged the motorcycle tops. But the guy who shared this on Twitter, who got thousands and thousands of retweets, at one point somebody showed him the BuzzFeed article that debunked this, and this was his reaction to it. BuzzFeed, more like buzzkill. Come on, a little fun never hurt anyone. And so, he had pushed this image out, and he was tweeting all the time about how many retweets it was getting. He was really enjoying it. And then somebody comes along and tells him it's not real, and his reaction isn't, oh, I guess I'll tell people that. It's like, leave me alone. I enjoyed the joke. Other people enjoyed the joke. Just let us be. And this is it's a really common reaction. In cases where people have, strong beliefs, whether it's political or like an anti-vaxxer, they're going to be even stronger about this, and they're going to have what's called the backfire effect, where the more you challenge their views, the more likely they are to double down on them as well. So how you approach the debunking is really important, and this was one of the pieces where I talked to journalists who are trying to do this work, and unfortunately there's not that many of them, but a lot of times they kind of feel like it's sort of a futile mission for them to be doing this when everybody else is jumping all over this stuff. So we need more people doing that and attempting different ways of doing it. Here are some examples. We got Max here from Gawker. They have a sort of sub-blog on Gawker called Antiviral that's doing this stuff. There's another one in the Gawker family called Factually that's part of Gizmodo, where they're checking things. The Washington Post does a weekly What Was Fake on the Internet This Week post. The writer tells me that it's always one of her most popular posts, so she is getting traffic for it. Snopes, of course, has been around for 20 years, and StopFake.org is a group of Ukrainian journalists who are debunking a lot of the misinformation coming from the Russian government. And so there are outfits out there, but there's really, compared to the problem, there's really not that many in the end. Okay, so before we get to our panel, I just wanted to offer some tips. I spoke to folks doing the work, as well as there's a body of research around how to sort of get past people's biases. The truth is that it's really hard, so it's not foolproof. But one of the things, so when we talk about handling rumors, for journalists, it's really important to understand, again, anytime you touch it, you're giving it some credibility, you're giving it more awareness, and that can actually lead to people believing it is true. So when you choose to jump on one is really important, and that sort of leads to the second point, which is to figure out within a news organization or for yourself what you need to see for you to want to give it a little bit more visibility. And I think it's just a conversation that should happen with basic kind of news values and content strategy in organizations, but I don't think it happens a lot specific to this kind of stuff. there's very basic steps people can take. You don't have to jump on it right away. You can, for example, follow the links back to see the original source. You can see who's claiming this. There were within about 5 to 10 minutes on most of these viral stories, we're with us at Emergent where we're looking at them. It's pretty quick to see whether there's something to it or it seems pretty light and pretty empty. And so I think it's a pretty basic thing to say, why don't you look at it a little bit before you actually jump on it and put it out there. And then the last thing is that I think for news organizations, it would be good to figure out which hedging language is your preferred. There are some that I think are stronger, but even just being consistent within one organization about how you present things to your audience is probably good for your regular readers or viewers or listeners because they start to get these cues. And so I think formalizing that a little bit is probably a good thing. When it comes to debunking, this is something that the skeptic community says a lot. You debunk the idea, not the person. The more you make it personal, the more you attack the person, the less likely they are to listen to you. So even though it may make you really angry, like the anti-vaxxers or whatever, going after them and attacking them is the best way to keep them, tied to their views. One of the other things that should be natural for us is people really, narratives and stories appeal to people. And in cases where they have misinformation, what you want to do is tell sort of a causal story of saying, well, actually, here's what happened, and then here's what happened, and that's why it's actually this. If you just say, no, that's wrong, that's not enough. So you want to actually replace the narrative that they have in their head with a counter-narrative, and stories stick much more. So a clinical fact-based debunking is not as good as one that sort of tells a causal narrative and can stick with people a little bit more. Sources are really important. If you can actually find other people who are aligned with that person's worldview or seen as credible in their community and have them do the debunking rather than you in the journalist's voice doing it, that's more effective because they identify with that source more than you, and that source isn't lecturing to them, that source is somebody they connect with. So that's really important. And the last thing is you want to avoid restating the misinformation as much as possible. So you would say Barack Obama is a Christian more than you would say Barack Obama is not a Muslim. And the more that you can kind of reinforce the truth, the better off you are, because there is this connection between repetition and belief. And so you want to repeat it as little as possible in actually doing the debunking. So that's, it's a long report. That's not everything, but pretty much the highlights I would say. So we're going to do our panel now. Should we take some questions now or go right to the panel? Let's go to the panel. Okay, so we've got 3 great people here. Come on up, you guys. We're going to talk about this stuff and other things. Thank you.
I think I might have gotten my mic clipped off. Did I break it?
Don't never think about it.
Thank you.
Oh, good.
Okay, you all switched on, guys?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So so we'll definitely have lots of time for questions. I wanted to start with the discussion. I'm going to actually quote Max and start with you. So Max wrote a memo sort of setting out Gawker's priorities in 2015. And so one of the lines in the priorities memo was already ankle deep in smarmy bullshit and fake viral garbage. We are now standing at the edge of a gurgling swamp of it. And then you went on to sort of say what you wanted the approach to be. And I think it's closely related to some of the challenges that I outlined here. So maybe you want to take it from that and sort of say what you set as a priority when it comes to this stuff that's out there.
Yeah, you talk about the sort of the point and reference way of covering viral stuff, which is something that we used for a while until it became pretty clear that it was not just sort of personally destroying our souls, but actually rendering us just another faceless viral operation out of hundreds of them on the internet. So the next step in that, if we can't give up on covering this stuff, because it is ultimately part of what we think about as our mission, is making sure that we're covering things that are on the internet, is to help guide people through it. So rather than point at it, maybe take them by the wrist and the back of and the small of their back and move them away from the bad stuff, or say that's not good, that's shit, please do not read or retweet or share this thing. we're still working out the best ways to do it. I mean, the problem is largely structural, and it's difficult to overcome the incentives that Facebook gives publishers, which are for positivity, uncritical reproduction of context-free images and snippets of text. We've even found some difficulty getting our debunking posts shared on Facebook. We think, in fact, because Facebook is itself trying to start suppressing fake stories. So as it identifies stories that certain keywords or certain kinds of stories that are fake, when you try to share the debunkings of those stories, which obviously share the subjects and keywords, that stuff gets sort of dies on a vine. I mean, even if it wouldn't have already, because people don't really want to share debunkings. It's not the way they want to share a crazy story they just heard. And so until those kinds of structural incentive-based problems are solved, it's a tough road to hoe, and I'm not sure how we can how we can figure out the ways to make our business interests and our journalistic interests align.
Have you actually seen, like you're talking about specific posts not doing as well? Like for you, obviously you're accountable for traffic on Gawker. I mean, have you noticed any changes with sort of trying to apply this?
I mean, so when I say it's a structural problem, part of what I mean is that we have always found that putting the same amount of work tends to turn into the same number of page views. It's a very rough calculation, but if you spend 8 hours working on a really good story and doing the reporting and breaking news, or just writing something really smart and beautiful and worth reading, that single post often will do the same amount of traffic as 8 hours worth of like just aggregation and viral hunting. That was true up until about 2012, and then Facebook, maybe 2013, and then Facebook kind of turned on the spigot, and now there's nothing that doesn't, I mean, the incentives are all geared towards just pulling the slot machine lever over and over and over again, just hoping that one of the bland viral stories is going to hit and go out, and go forward. So I have completely lost my train of thought. What was I talking about? What was the question?
Whether you've seen, applying the strategy, whether it's had an effect on traffic.
Oh, yeah. So in that sense, we're not ever going to be able to reach the same level of success that we would under a model where we're really just gunning for Facebook-style social media traffic. But I do believe that if we can effectively combine solid reporting and writing with some degree of like viral debunking that can ride that wave a little bit, that we can get numbers that approximate what we've gotten in the past. And in addition, we are thinking seriously, like a lot of organizations are, about other measurements that we can use to gauge our success and our influence, especially because it's clearer now than ever that page views as a measurement are only tell part of the picture. And especially talking about headlines, I mean, the scroll depth on some of these things, people don't scroll, they don't stay on the page, they see the headline, especially with something that's shared.
Yeah. So Anna, you guys at Dig, you have some ways of seeing the things that are starting to take off in places online. When you see something, I mean, you must see a lot of these kind of questionable stories early on. What's the approach for you guys as sort of a more aggregation-oriented place?
Sure. So we have the luxury of being able to sit back. We don't really do all that much original content, although you've posted some great
disclosure I have written for you, yes.
On Dig. So that affords us, we're not in the breaking news game, we're not really in the page view game, although some of the concerns that Max was talking about on Facebook certainly apply to us. But we can kind of take a step back and really kind of take a survey of the landscape and really kind of do our best to make sure that we're not just reposting this kind of viral content. I was trying to think of some of these types of stories that we have posted on the front page, and we had the 3 boob woman story, but only it's a hoax version,
right?
Because we had assumed that most of our readers had seen the first version. We didn't put it up, but then the fact that it was a hoax became a story, and we felt that our readers are people who would be savvy enough to be interested in the fact that it was a hoax.
Do you remember how it did?
I think it did pretty well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The three-boobed woman gave a lot to news organizations,
Yeah.
if nothing else, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
We had this pretty viral video. It was an archer who, it was 6 minutes of just
Right.
kind of crummy, right? And there was this blog post that was kind of took him down, and he claimed that if you actually, an arrow actually couldn't go through, it would splinter the wood in a different way. And that debunking of that video, which granted did amazingly well for us, also for just kind of a random blog post debunking something that wasn't even the same day, I think it was a couple of days later, did amazingly well, kind of beyond what we would expect for that type of content. So, that's kind of more where our bread and butter is, I would say.
Right. And so, Margarita, for you, you've been at Reuters and some other places. You're now at a pretty new news organization. Has this come up as a conversation, sort of as you folks are developing what you're going to do with the site and everything like that? What are you going to jump on, what are you not, and what are the standards in that sense?
Absolutely, and I think my experience at Reuters taught me that every single wire agency has a very different culture. And I think that there are a lot of people who work in news organizations that don't know that. They don't know the culture of AP versus AFP versus Reuters, and there are different structures for verifying. And since a lot of news organizations have, these kind of general subscriptions, right, to wire services or even photo services, they don't really compare and contrast except when they're frustrated that they don't see a story that maybe the LA Times got first. So the only time that I think most news organizations in the U.S. or probably the world ever care about the culture of really the history of breaking news, which comes from wire agencies, is when they're frustrated that they don't have a story first. But the fact is that they have very different cultures. And so being able to know where you're getting your information from while you're working somewhere is very important. So that, for me, that builds the culture.
And so you're saying that, what AFP would jump on versus what AP would jump on versus, and is it
Absolutely.
actually like a significant difference between the three of them?
It's a pretty huge difference, enough that I could probably think of 5 or 6 examples in the next few minutes.
Right.
Yeah.
And what about Fusion? I mean, you're a new news organization. You're trying to build up an audience on your website. There's lots of places that have shown that jumping on things quickly can get you some traffic. Is that a temptation there?
It certainly is. I'll give you an example. Fidel Castro dies every once in a while, and certainly after the news about U.S. and Cuba, opening relations, everybody wanted, there was this feeling where's Fidel Castro? We haven't seen him. And every time somebody asks the question, where's Fidel Castro, right? You have a sense. And so, of course, there was one day where someone in our Latin American bureau said, hey, should we write about this? People are talking about it. And right then and there, we said no, because talking about a rumor gives credence to it without, some more context. What we did do was a second day story, which was that Fidel Castro didn't die yesterday story, which got tons of traffic, and it did really well. And so there's a way to turn, these question marks into exclamation points, into celebrations of the human process.
Right. And I mean, I guess that's, one of the sort of challenges that I see out there is how do you create these things that do well? I mean, the Archer one was sort of that came out of nowhere, and all of a sudden this crazy post analyzing archery techniques is seems like a really interesting thing that people might read and sort of give them an education at the same time that it's sort of debunking. Are there any templates that any of you have seen that tend to work at all? I mean, what I see a lot is the no XXX is not happening headline. I don't know if anyone's sort of tested that to see if that works, but is there any indication you guys have of what you think is a good approach for doing this kind of work?
I mean, we've found that roundups of debunkings tend to do better than single one-off things. I personally, and this is partly just an editorial thing, I can't stand headlines that start with no, comma, or that sound like they're part of a conversation that maybe you're not part of, or that otherwise play to that social media headline tendency to be to sound like a tweet with capital letters for every word. part of it is about, so something like the Castro rumor I can see doing very well because there's a very specific community or set of communities through which the rumor is going to spread, and that then through which the debunking should spread too. But for stories like the three-breasted woman, or really any one of these kind of like UK tabloid viral stories, the audience is so diffuse that there's absolutely no guarantee that your debunking will get seen by the same people who saw the original rumor. I mean, even when we're talking about a story that garners 1 million hits, you know, Facebook has some insane number of users who have the chance to see a story, and so the 1 million people that saw that may be a totally different group of people than would see the other one. So in that sense, those kinds of roundups where you can get a bunch of different stories, especially when you get a lot of photos, because a lot of the times those are good photos, those are cool photos to see, they're just not, you know, real. People will get that, they'll look through it, they'll check it out. You know, we do pretty well with general sort of guides to a specific news story and a bunch of the different rumors or bits of gossip that have been going around on it, and that we can say, this one is, you know, not true, this one we sure wish it was true, but we're pretty sure it's not, and that kind of thing. We're really still playing around with figuring out what stuff works best.
Has anybody else seen stuff that maybe was effective or?
Yeah, I suppose I also don't love the no kind of construction. I think what we try to do at Dig is certainly have a conversational tone. I mean, I think the difference I think for Dig is that people aren't getting to our content through Facebook. We post on Facebook, but we drive to other places. So we kind of expect, and the types of things that we post on Facebook we hope to be sure about. So we kind of look at our audience in a somewhat different way, in that they're a little bit more sealed off and kind of can participate in a conversation with our editorial. So we kind of play around with different constructions. We try to make the debunking as appealing to click on as possible.
I don't know if I have any specific editorial examples, but I have noticed how quickly the mood changes on Twitter if someone asks a question, and the one question is source ? And it's really annoying. But if you see something being tweeted about, feel free to ask somebody on Twitter, you know, what's your source? And everyone has a right to ask that question, especially journalists. I think we should challenge each other maybe a little bit more sometimes.
On that note, are there outlets that when you see it's coming from a particular outlet, you're just like, yeah, we're gonna wait on that, or we're gonna let that sit for now? Are there places that are like no-go zones for you folks?
I mean, all the UK tabloids. We trust the Mail a little bit, I admit. I mean, they get real stories and they have scoops sometimes, but the Mirror is just garbage. I mean, Elite Daily I saw up there is garbage. Almost all of those new right-wing sites, Free Beacon, Daily Caller, garbage. You know, and I say that as somebody who edits a site that is often garbage. I mean, there's very few. The Daily News, everything that's not about New York City is garbage. I mean, the Post is garbage just by virtue of being the Post. It strikes me that right now it feels like there are fewer sources that I trust than there are sources that I don't trust. And again, like, we have very low standards for posting. It's just that there's a certain kind of story that enters this economy, and then all of a sudden there's 25 different sites that are doing that story, and basically that array of 25 sites belongs in the category of we need to really make sure that we know what we're dealing with before we put it on.
Tell me more about your low standards. What are your low standards?
Well, I mean, we're a gossip site. We publish rumors and unsourced, and claims, thinly sourced claims all the time. Our strategy in that sense is that we want to be honest and transparent about how we came to about the information to the extent that we can with our sources. And ideally and theoretically, we've built up a 10-year, 11-year record of sort of accuracy to some extent, and at least that a sense of how our readership can take us and trust us. So there's plenty of stuff where I feel totally comfortable using a headline like, source : such and such a thing, because that's a source that I've talked to or that we've talked to, or rumor : part of, as you say, part of the function of a rumor is to help people sort of get an angle on a certain kind of story, and we think of ourselves as doing that in real time about all kinds of different stories. But we also recognize now that, you know, maybe when we started 11 years ago, there was a sense that the media, certainly in the U.S., was too sort of staid and stodgy and unwilling to publish. Now the biggest, you know, media outlets out there are maybe a little too willing to publish, and that we can serve a more valuable function by being a better arbiter of what rumors are worth pursuing and what rumors are not.
Margarita, for you, I mean, you were, on Max's point of like the change over time, I mean, that was one of the things that I felt was clear, is that like the standards for following on have just kind of gone into the basement. You were at a wire service. I mean, following on is part of that, the culture there. I mean,
We call it updating.
updating. Okay, so I mean, what do you
yeah.
see with that perspective as what's going on out there in terms of, you know, the standards of following on or updating?
You know, I think I can speak on behalf of every former social media editor out there, which is there is huge pressure to share. And when, you know, your editor is saying, you know, shares equal success for me, you know, when the editor-in-chief is saying that, traffic equals success for me, you have a lot of social media editors who will totally play up unverified rumors because they know their bosses are going to be happy. And the standards come from the top. They really do. Mm-hmm. They really come from the top. And there's nothing a social media editor can do if they're working on behalf of an unverified claim. So the standards are getting lower. I think everyone is certainly frustrated by it. But you know, there's a lot of hope out there. I'm sitting next to two people who are giving me a lot right now. And certainly we see new media companies making a change. I don't think you have a New York in 2015 where new companies make such bold standards and make them transparent. I don't remember the last time you had new media companies publishing, you know, entire editorial standards to the public to discuss the way that we're doing now. I think it's a very good sign.
Do you guys, we'll get back to the sort of the no-go zones, but I mean, do you guys feel like we've gotten to the point where there's just so much of that cluster of people that get on anything that you have to figure out a counter strategy now? Like, is there just is it a point of saturation that for you, Max, and for other folks saying, well, we don't need to get on that because everybody else is? Like, are we at that point where the counter strategy is the natural thing to start doing?
I mean, I suppose, again, we're in somewhat of a different position, but as far as coverage goes, we try to stay away from those types of, that type of content. We like to be, you know, have comprehensive coverage. We like to be timely and newsly, but we trust that a dig reader, if they go to BuzzFeed and they see that kind of point and repeat story of, well, this just exists on Twitter, we don't feel compelled to repost those types of stories. So again, we're kind of in a somewhat lucky position where we don't have to deal with competing with that kind of chunk of the internet.
It almost seems like the sites that do that, like they reach pretty good traffic heights. That at a certain point, like that's sort of what they get, I guess, and then you have to figure out something else, I suppose. Yeah. Because I mean, for you guys at Dig, like you're doing aggregation, but you have to find the things that people are interested in, and if you felt that you could just follow on those and get traffic out of that, then you might consider doing that. But you're saying it's not actually a viable strategy for you guys, huh?
We like to show stories to people that they might not see otherwise. We like to kind of highlight smaller blogs and kind of we really trust the intelligence and the kind of media savvy of our reader, and so we can kind of expect that they've seen that thing that's driving all the traffic, and if it's really, all exceptions aside, like they've probably seen that really big thing, and then we can talk about the pumpkin spice condom story on a kind of meta level a few weeks later, because and not ever really mention it on the front or report or link to a story that reports it, because we it's that expectation that our reader has already seen it elsewhere.
Margarita, I had a survey that I asked people to fill out at one point when I was doing the research to talk about sort of what they look for in order to decide whether they're going to go with something. And so you had filled that out and talked about some of the sort of signals of trustworthiness or the process that you would go through to kind of check out a claim. Do you want to go through that a little bit in terms of how you approach that?
Yeah, I think I recommend that, everyone first, if whatever your beat is, you develop those sources. I've gone back to sources many times to verify information within different communities. So having, run a live blog, for Syria, for example, for Reuters, having sources who have been there or are on the ground or are going there, that's important. So A, sourcing. But two, I would just, you talked about filling the gaps psychologically. That's terrible. Don't do it. Don't do it. If you're looking at two pieces of information and you're in a breaking news situation, just don't fill the gaps. I'd rather be second than first. In terms of trustworthiness, though, I think that goes back to the question of how we measure trustworthiness, and I think, to Anna's point about respecting your readers and knowing that success on your metrics or on a higher standard will come because you're respecting your readers. There's a reason why the media is one of the lowest respected industries in the United States, and maybe part of it is because we disrespect our readers too much. And so taking a little bit more time to think about why you trust something and the fact that you're asking someone else to trust something that you're trusting is a huge part of it. I think sometimes we forget and we play a little loose sometimes with words and headlines, and the consequences are much broader. And to that point, I would just say when you are dealing with unverified information and you do trust it, remember that you can limit the influence that you have in rumor spreading. If you're not sure about a claim, you can choose just to share the story in a certain context on a certain social network. I've noticed that some news organizations tend to play around with rumors a little bit differently on Facebook versus Twitter, right? Twitter's a little bit faster, so they play a little bit looser because they think they can correct it more quickly. Tumblr has a different timing than Facebook.
So you see different approaches based on the platforms, and Twitter is probably the most loose, the fastest one that you see people sort of playing with stuff on? Yeah,
I noticed that people, for example, have an exorbitant amount of trust in Instagram. It seems as if you put a filter on a photo, it becomes true. And it
Wait a minute, that's not the case?
Apparently not, but for some reason people, to back to your point about trustworthiness, I've noticed that there's this weird thing, every time there's a new social media network, people think whatever that hot social media network is doing must be true. So you'll see a photoshopped, I've been working a lot with Snapchat lately, and I'm just noticing a lot of Snapchat rumors now just because I'm in the space, and you can Photoshop anything and say, oh, somebody just Snapchatted this to me, and it's quite a funny joke to see, but it's a joke. So the fascination, part of trustworthiness metrics is not being fascinated by whatever new social trend is out there, including social networks.
Anna, what do you guys look for when you're looking at something and you think it might appeal to the audience? What are the things that usually sort of set it off saying, well, maybe we're just going to leave this?
Well, we like to kind of follow the links to the original source, especially with harder news. We try to find local sources because that gives us an opportunity to link to, instead of a Washington Post, to whatever kind of local source, if there is one. So that's a big step for us. I mean, most of the no-go sites that we've mentioned today, hold for us. There's always a new editor who kind of makes that one first mistake and kind of gets humiliated. But so just kind of.
What punishment do you give editors who do that?
But so those kinds of things, just being kind of. The longer you do it, the more kind of instinctual it is about kind of what sources to trust and where to stay away from. We kind of sit on a lot of data. We sit on a lot of information that we need to parse, and so kind of just sitting there for a long time helps with that process.
How do you sort of create a culture where that kind of restraint is okay? Because a lot of people, like Margarita was saying, like they're getting pressure from the top, like you haven't published anything in an hour or what have you.
I really think it's because we're not really playing the page view game quite yet. We don't feel compelled to have a post up about some sort of breaking news and have that post be kind of pushed out, when other reporting on it is better. I mean, our kind of, our mission statement is that there's great stuff on the internet, and we want to highlight the best of the best. And so for us, that's the goal, instead of sort of trying to do a B- job competing against all the amazing news sites that exist out there.
So Max, what's the conversation like for you folks in terms of you sort of see something and you're trying to figure out? It sounds like it's more a conversation of how we're going to treat it rather than necessarily whether you deal with it or not.
I mean, here's maybe a good example is the recent Bobby Christina Brown, Whitney Houston's daughter, is in a coma, and there's been a huge number of rumors in a bunch of gossip sites about her status. And we spent a lot of time talking this through today, or over the last week or so, about whether or not to be, we're a celebrity gossip site. This is absolutely within our purview. It's the kind of thing we would cover, except that this is a case where they're coming from very sketchy sites, and there is very little sort of to go on beyond the provenance here. And so the conversation has to be sort of, is this, like, do we trust this source? Is this somebody who's been right about this kind of thing before? Is this like like Page 6, for example, is a pretty reputable gossip outlet. The Daily Mail is much less so. I think the Atlanta Journal-Constitution actually had some stuff, and that's sort of, that's right in the middle there, I guess. And we talk it through with a bunch of editors in the room. We make a judgment call not just based on how much we trust the source, but how much we think us giving this rumor a new platform will affect the other coverage of it. Because at this point, we do have to reckon with the fact that we are leaders in some very scary capacity. And then we think about whether or not this is something that our readers need to or want to know. That if by not publishing it, we are holding our readers back, holding information back from our readers in a way that reflects negatively on us. Because one of the founding principles of Gawker is the idea that we aren't gatekeepers, that we share the things that we know with the readers whom we trust. And I use Bobby Christina Brown as an example because it's very easy to sort of make this judgment call when it's some kind of government NSA secrets thing, and you're like, well, of course we have to let the readers know. And when it's literally sort of celebrity gossip of the most tawdry kind, we do have to think about, like, is this something that we feel like our readers know? Our readers can get mad if we have this thing and we're not sharing it with them. Are they going to think that we've gone soft, or that we've otherwise sort of decided to professionalize ourselves in a way that reflects negatively on our status as purveyors of gossip? And in this case, we didn't go with it, and I had been totally happy to have not gone with any of these rumors, because none of them have panned out or turned out to be true. But there have been plenty of times where we've sort of, the challenge that we're finding now is, now that I've spent the last 6 months sort of breathing fire and being cranky about all the viral stuff, I've realized that I've made a lot of my editors and writers scared. And so they'll take cat videos and they'll try and like source the cat video, and it's sort of like, well, it's just a cat video. You really actually can just put that up there. You don't have to find out whether or not it's real. So the like balancing, like the whole promise of the web is that you can give writers and editors a huge degree of autonomy over what they do and what they write. And so the balance has to be, the question is, how can you instill genuinely good news sense in them, and how can you balance the confidence that you need to be able to publish, write, and edit and publish yourself with the kind of necessary degree of skepticism and fear of getting it wrong that prevents you from just publishing literally anything that comes across your desk.
Yeah, that's one of the pieces. Like I ended it by giving some advice, but I also know that when you tell people, well, try not to repeat it and like get down to specifics like that, in a lot of cases, journalists on the job aren't necessarily going to go through this kind of checklist in their mind, right?
Yeah.
And so how much can we sort of formalize this, do you think? Is it really just sort of you hammering them a little bit so that they, there's a little bit of fear, and there's, but also teaching them a little bit. Like, how do you get it to be formalized, or is that even possible?
I mean, one thing that is sort of one of the weird things about this question is that traditionally this would be a debate to be had between a writer and an editor, and the writer, the journalist, is going to, traditionally or sort of legendarily, will be the one who's pushing for the story that's thinly sourced or based on rumors, and the editor is the one who's asked to be cautious. And in our case, because so much of the work is done independently, that is a conversation that has to happen like within a writer's own head, or oftentimes in the comment section of a piece, much to the detriment of my writer's self-esteem or dignity. I don't think there is a real formal practice. I think it really is a question of giving people the experience and the sort of mental and professional tools to make the right judgment call at the right time. Every story is different, every category of story is different, every outlet is different, every writer is different. Some of my writers I still have to pull back, and some of my writers I still have to push forward a little bit.
And so, Anna, what do you guys do with the new editors then, in terms of this? Do you sort of let them fail a bit and have ridicule and then deal with it, or?
I think it's really hard, especially with some of the younger editors who are kind of just new to the media landscape or aren't used to kind of applying a critical eye to just a mass of sources that we get to see. We see a lot of much crazier stuff that I don't even remember the names of these websites, but like they come across our desk just because from the data side of it. Actually they tend to be more conservative than just from the kind of small sample size of editors we've had at Dig over the past 2 years. They tend to want to get it right, which maybe is a commendation of the people we've hired. But yeah, I mean, I think it's trial and error. You can't ever fully instill in someone that kind of gut instinct of this doesn't pass the smell test, but you can encourage them to follow the sources, at least through links. You can encourage them to kind of not jump on just the first link they see, but kind of shop around, see if it was reported differently from different outlets, and kind of we always tell people to slow down a little bit and just kind of see what rises to the top.
If folks have questions, please get ready for them. We've got a microphone there. Margarita, I wanted to sort of ask you, I mean, Fusion is very new. You've got people coming in from different traditions, different news organizations. Is this a conversation that's come up so far? I mean, you gave the Fidel Castro example. What's sort of happened so far in terms of this?
Absolutely. We're very lucky to have two parent companies that have a long history in the media, Univision and ABC Disney, and they both bring different sets of expectations for media. And we have it every day with every topic, and that just goes back to my point about I think 2015 is a good year for new media companies, specifically with debunking. It's great that we're even having this conversation. I don't think it existed a few years ago.
Right. So has it come up that this is actually a strategy you folks want to try and apply?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Sourcing is key. I think when you get down to social media sourcing, which is kind of my expertise, you can be a little bit more, you can be much more technical. Story choice, I think, takes editorial jurisdiction, but knowing how to verify a Twitter account, Instagram account, how something is fake, Photoshop, that kind of thing. Those are all technical skills that you can learn.
Do you? I mean, so these are skills you've developed. Do you think that you need everyone in the newsroom to have a sort of a basic level of this stuff, or is it good to have sort of specialists who do a deep dive?
I think that every desk should have an expert on sourcing, a sourcing expert. If you're part of the media organization that's sourcing from the internet, from social networks, it's important that no desk is left behind.
Right. Good. So we've got a microphone there.
Yeah.
Any instructions?
Raise your hand if you do have a question. I know there's one here. While you're just thinking about it, I just want to get one question in. Max, I want to, and definitely the other panelists as well, I want to try and connect your editorial strategy to the business strategy. You've embarked on a journey towards greater credibility while still dealing with the same subject matter. Is that because you think you can get greater audiences or is it because you think you can get higher revenue per ad because you've got a different kind of advertiser?
It's because the ad sales guy tells me he can sell. I mean, I don't know. I doubt that we're going to get. We can definitely get bigger audiences. We're not going to grow at the same rate. But I think that what we can do, and what we've always traditionally done, which is claim that we have a particularly savvy, sophisticated, rich, urban, youthful audience, and that by like an important part of this conversation for us is that sense of sophistication. And so it's a little bit about targeting, but it doesn't mean that we're going to stop growing either.
Growth is very important for a company that's been around for only about 2 years. But growth while respecting your audience. I think millennials, most polls show that millennials, they really do latch on to brands, to media brands or whatever brands they are that they trust from a philosophical perspective. And so I think if you want to appeal to future audiences, you have to have standards that might be a little bit different than page views.
Interestingly enough, while you were up here, Brian Williams was suspended for 6 months, and Jon Stewart, it was announced to step down. And I thought that it was a really interesting point. No, Comedy Central is. I saw it on Twitter. It must be true. But the point was that I thought was really interesting about it is that people are sort of celebrating that Brian Williams is being suspended for lying, and then Jon Stewart, who was the fake news, who people actually trusted a lot more than real news, the people are mourning that. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on the fact that I guess Jon Stewart was because he was so open about not having to tell the truth, that he felt perhaps more inclined to tell the truth. And I guess I don't know exactly what my question is, but I just thought it was an interesting dichotomy, and I wondered what your thoughts were on just the idea that so many people really say that they get their news from Jon Stewart.
Well, I mean, I can say it's hugely instructive for Gawker. Gawker is not a satire site. We absolutely report the news, and we try and hope that everything we write is factual. But what you say about the sort of honesty and transparency with which Stewart presented the things that he was doing, which is to say that his biases were always very clear and his own stake in what he was saying was always clear, makes him a trusted source. And at our best, that is what Gawker is able to do too. It's by not sort of putting on the mask of objectivity, or even for that matter, commitment to pure factual reporting, that readers get a better sense of who we are and what we're bringing to the table and why they should trust us more.
I would say that Jon Stewart traffics in hypocrisy, right? He often the meat of his segments is just pitting the same person's words on one day against that same person's words on another day, and so the same lesson can be applied to Brian Williams, is that John, the biggest kind of betrayal is the hypocrisy. I think it's a little bit different from what we've been talking about up here, because there's that emotional kind of connection of when you feel betrayed by a personality, as opposed to just a sort of a piece of content that's out there.
I've been actually thinking quite a bit about Brian Williams the past 24 hours, because I left my keys in my office and I had to go back from Greenpoint to the Upper West Side to get them. And on the way, the taxi driver and I were talking about Brian Williams because he wanted to know what happened. And he said something very interesting. He said, well, I guess he can write books now. And I said, well, yes, but what do you mean? And he said, well, isn't that what people do in the media? They lie and they lie and they lie until they get a career writing books, and then no one ever fact checks them. No one ever fact checks books. Maybe.
Wow.
And you should blog for Gawker. He's absolutely.
I didn't have any. I should have gotten his card. I didn't have anything to say, but what it made me think was that we've always had media forms that play with truth-telling and narrative-telling and storytelling, and I think Jon Stewart is a storyteller perhaps in a different way than someone who's writing a story about the news.
I just wanted to ask, kind of like, this is more directed towards Craig, but the panel too. Is there a statute of limitations as far as time goes? I noticed in the chart that you had that it looked like the debunking took an average of 2 days, or 1 or 2 days
Right.
extra. The news cycle moves very fast now. So is there a set time?
So one of the things that we saw was there were stories that within a few hours they were resolved, and the faster you got to that resolution, the more you saw people tend to sort of update that original post and actually deal with that. And one of the other things I'll note that I didn't share with this, but sites like Gawker or BuzzFeed, ones that are a little more digitally native, we saw them more inclined to go in and update an existing post than older media would actually just leave that post the way it was and write a completely new story. So it's like the tradition of doing that was still there, even though they could go back and update it. And so at the same time that if stuff was resolved relatively quickly, it tended to be better debunked. But also the longer it went on, we saw fewer people come back to that story. So like we didn't do any calculations to say, if it goes past the 12-hour point, good luck getting a correction or an update. But I think at a certain point, like the Three-Breasted Woman, it took about 24 to 36 hours. But because it had so much spread, there were a fair amount who came back to it, but not enough still. So yeah, I think if it's hours more than days, you probably have a better chance of getting it better debunked. Yeah. And someone's welcome to take our data and do that calculation, though. So I'll throw that out. There's one over here. Yes.
Yeah, I thought Margarita's point about Instagram and what kind of platform plays a role in this. It's interesting from the perspective of, it must have been Ezra Klein who wrote something about how much, as journalists, we use Twitter, but that many readers are obviously still getting the bulk of their news via Facebook. And it feels like a lot of the debunking stuff happens on Twitter, and I'm just wondering from a newsroom perspective, kind of adding that element. The follow-up on Facebook doesn't seem to happen, so I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
So you can edit a Facebook post, and one of the things that I think Facebook has been really great about is that it shows an edit history if you know where to click on the post. But I think it's very important to make sure that long-standing. So from what I understand, there's a shelf life for these Facebook posts, 3 to 6 days-ish in people's feeds on average. So if you're in a news organization and you know that you've got an old Facebook post that's not updated, it's very important that you go back, because there's a likelihood that 50,000 people are looking at it right now, 5 days later.
So you're saying they should go back and they should edit it, or they should hide it and do another one?
Oh, they should edit it. I think they should edit it and have the public. It's on public record that the post has been edited. And on that point, I'll just note that Facebook also has a recent update from the past few months where you can essentially you can schedule something to disappear in the feed after a certain period of time. So it auto hides. But I prefer the public record.
Mm-hmm. One over here, yes.
So I guess it's a similar or related question about Facebook. I mean, as you were talking about the ways that changes in the Facebook algorithm have sort of affected the kind of traffic you get for what stories. I mean, I guess the question is, are we all just sort of playing in Facebook's world? And this is all kind of nice, and we can try things, and it's very cute. But what Facebook decides is what will be done. I mean, can we as journalists who care about this really operate outside of what Facebook sort of is structurally forcing us to do?
I'm trying to think of the right way to answer this. Facebook is huge and terrifying, and it is, just to the journalism students here, like it is now and for the next 5 years the absolute most important and thing that is happening to the journalism industry. And to the extent that Facebook's traffic spigot, which shows no real signs of disappearing and may taper off and eventually disappear, but for now it's here, To the extent that that directs where the money is going, that is going to change a lot. That being said, what I would like to see Gawker do, for example, over the next few years is carve out some kind of space for a Facebook independent publication. Obviously, there's no such thing, and there won't be, and there doesn't need to be. I want to be on Facebook, but to the extent that we can keep our Facebook traffic at a steady 1/4 rather than like a full 1/2, I will feel much more comfortable about what we're doing and how we're doing it. It just means that we're not going to be getting, and I mean we never were, any of the VC money that's flowing into content organizations and media organizations. There's not as much sort of free play and experimentation. I mean, I say 5 years. This could be an 18-month thing too. Who the hell knows? But yeah, I mean, this is the stuff I lie awake thinking about at night.
Yeah, I would say that just given how capricious Facebook is, I mean, for a couple of months we were our traffic from Facebook was kind of coming in little dribbles, and then all of a sudden it really felt it was a spigot. Someone turned it on and it was great. And so the lesson we learned from that was that you have to build a news source or a company that doesn't care about, or that cares about Facebook, but that can survive without Facebook. Because if you're relying on Facebook for traffic, if you're trying to play that game, they'll kind of pull the rug out from underneath you just as soon as you feel comfortable. And so strategies for success outside of Facebook are paramount.
I spend some of my free time, because I don't know, I'm a social media nerd, like just checking out like who's up and coming on these platforms, on these new platforms. And I don't think there's a Vine famous person out there who's thinking about a Facebook strategy, and that tells you the difference between the medium, right, or the media and the way it's distributed. They're distributing based off of impressions within a certain context on a certain platform, and they can get 9 million impressions, or let's say loops on Vine, or 46,000 people will see a Snapchat, or whatever it is. They're selling ad space against that, and in a dream world, media companies would start selling ad space, otherwise known as banner ads, on social media, so that they can start moving some of their content from their site and their ad sales guys from pressuring folks to click on things to view things. And I think once we make the final shift, and I don't know if it's in 18 months or if it's in 5 years, but once we start acting a little bit more like Vine stars with our content, I think you'll find a diversification of what we're doing. And on that point, I want to just make a plug for Fusion. We cut a video about Eric Garner into, I think, 6 different parts, and we put it on Vine, and it was illustrated by Molly Crabapple. And that's our way of telling the Vine audience that we care about what they know about what happened in New York.
Yep.
So for those of us
Yeah, it's on.
So for those of us who might be in the breaking news world, is it hopeless? Can we not be debunkers while we're currently bunking? What do you guys recommend for us?
I mean, it's the same struggle that people who report on breaking news have always had. It just is happening a little bit faster and in front of a somewhat bigger audience. Being smart, thinking on your feet, knowing how to source and being good at sourcing. I mean, it's funny. This is the rules haven't really changed, and the things that we're supposed to be doing haven't changed that much either. And to the extent that you can teach yourself how to think well under pressure. I mean, that's maybe the most important thing, is in situations where there is news that is breaking and there's a huge amount of pressure to be getting something on the page or uploaded there, that you can be critical and smart about how you're doing it. I wish there was a one-size-fits-all solution, but there's not.
I think what I learned about myself anyway, and about some of the social media editors I've worked with, or breaking news editors, is at some point it's like you can only turn on a car so fast, and you have to know how fast you can turn on a car, and you have to trust your instincts. And if anyone else is asking you to turn on that car, start driving faster, know how fast you can verify things. Everybody has a little different timing on that.
Great. Well, look, thank you all for your questions. Thank you to our panel here. Thanks for coming tonight.
And let me add my thanks. Craig Silverman, it's a really great report. It's on the web, so send a link out to you, to all of your Twitter feeds. Thanks again. Thanks very much to the Knight Foundation and the Tower Foundation who fund our research. Thank you very much for to the Brown Institute for hosting us, and the Brown family who paid for this incredible space. Have a great night, safe trip home, have some cheese, grab a report. Thanks a lot.
Cheese and a report, what more could you want?